They thought the carriage house was where a family kept what no longer mattered, but sometimes the smallest building behind a grand home is where the truth waits with its light still on. The rain had stopped just before morning in Willow Creek, Kentucky, leaving the sidewalks dark and shining and the courthouse lawn jeweled with drops that clung to every blade of grass. The law office of Mr. Everett Langford sat between a brick pharmacy and a closed tailor shop, its front windows fogged at the corners, its brass door handle worn smooth by generations of worry, inheritance, and last wishes. Nathan Cole stood near the back wall, not because anyone told him to, but because men who have spent too many nights without a place to belong often learn to give the room more space than they take. He was 40 years old, a white homeless veteran with a tall, broad-shouldered frame that still held the discipline of service, though his olive field jacket had faded at the seams and his denim shirt was softened from years of washing in laundromat sinks. His jeans were worn pale at the knees, his boots carried dried Kentucky mud along the soles, and his square, rugged face wore a week of stubble beneath dark brown hair touched with silver at the temples. He kept his hands folded in front of him, rough hands that knew engines, hinges, water pumps, battery cables, fence gates, and the stubborn dignity of fixing things no one else wanted to touch. Beside him sat Duke, his 6-year-old German shepherd, steady and alert, with a silver gray and tan coat, a strong chest, high ears, and amber eyes bright with the kind of attention that made strangers lower their voices. Duke wore a simple service harness, black and weathered, fitted close to his body like something earned rather than bought. He did not pull. He did not whine. He only watched the polished table at the front of the room where the Ellison family had gathered around Margaret Ellison's will like people waiting to be handed pieces of a life they had not cared to visit until it ended. The room smelled of old books, raincoats, coffee gone lukewarm, and the faint floral perfume of relatives dressed too carefully for grief. On the wall hung a framed watercolor of Ellison Manor, white columns, green lawn, oak trees, and a long gravel drive curved like a ribbon through old Kentucky money. Nathan had seen the manor only once from the road, years before, a house so large it seemed less built than declared. He had never imagined his name would be spoken inside a room connected to it. Mr. Langford cleared his throat and began reading. His voice was soft but practiced, the voice of a man who had learned to move sorrow forward one sentence at a time. To nieces and nephews went furniture, silver, paintings, accounts, parcels, and rooms in the big house whose curtains had been drawn for months. Chairs shifted. A woman dabbed at one eye without disturbing her makeup. A man in a navy sport coat nodded as if every item confirmed what he already believed the world owed him. Nathan listened without expectation. He had come only because the lawyer had called him twice and left a message at the church office where he sometimes picked up donated mail. Margaret Ellison had been kind to him once, but kindness from an old woman on a rainy Sunday did not usually become a legal matter. Then Mr. Langford paused, adjusted his glasses, and looked toward the back of the room. To Nathan Cole, he read, who stopped when others passed by, "I leave the carriage house behind Ellison Manor, including all contents lawfully belonging to that structure, along with any instructions attached to the rear property file." The silence that followed lasted only a breath before someone laughed. It was not loud, but it was sharp enough to scratch the air. "The carriage house," a younger man said under his breath. "She left him the garage." Another relative covered a smile with her hand. Someone whispered that the place smelled like old leather and rats. Someone else said it had not held anything useful since horses stopped being fashionable. Nathan did not answer. His face remained still, the way it did when people said homeless veteran stories like they were speaking about weather damage or abandoned houses, something sad but safely distant. He had learned that pride could survive without defending itself every time. But Duke changed. The German shepherd rose from his sit, slow and deliberate, his ears lifting toward the table. His gaze fixed not on the laughing relatives, not on the lawyer, not even on Nathan, but on the estate map unfolded beside the will. The map showed the manor, the lawns, the oak-lined drive, the creek, the old stone wall, and behind the house, drawn smaller than everything else, the carriage house. Duke took one quiet step forward. His nose angled toward that little shape of ink. His body went perfectly still, as if a sound too low for human hearing had passed through the floorboards and called his name. Nathan felt it before anyone else noticed, that subtle shift in the dog's breath, the same change he had trusted in parking lots, storms, empty roads, and long nights when Duke seemed to know which silence was safe and which one carried a warning. Mr. Langford looked from the dog to the map, then to Nathan, and something in the old lawyer's expression softened with recognition, as if Margaret had told him to expect exactly this. "Mrs. Ellison also asked that you receive this," he said. From a sealed envelope, he removed a small brass key tied to a strip of faded blue cloth. It was not polished. It was not impressive. It looked like something kept in an apron pocket, touched often, trusted quietly. Nathan stepped forward, each bootfall sounding too heavy in the room. When the key touched his palm, it was cold from the lawyer's desk, but it seemed to carry a warmth underneath, like metal remembering a hand. A folded note came with it, addressed only to him. Mr. Langford did not read it aloud. Nathan opened it carefully. Margaret's handwriting leaned slightly to the right, elegant but tired. She had written one sentence. The truth was never in the manor. Nathan looked up. The relatives were still whispering. The rain began again outside, soft against the windows, turning the morning silver. Duke stood beside the table, amber eyes locked on the tiny carriage house drawn behind the grand white mansion, and for the first time since Nathan had slept in his Chevrolet pickup behind the Willow Creek laundromat, he felt the strange, dangerous beginning of being chosen. Not for money. Not for pity. Not even for shelter. For a truth someone had protected long enough to place it in the hands of a man who still knew how to stop in the rain. Nathan left Mr. Langford's office with the brass key in his palm and Duke walking so close that the dog's shoulder brushed his leg at every other step. Willow Creek had settled into that gray hour after rain when the whole town seemed washed but not yet awake, when storefront windows held soft reflections of passing trucks, and puddles gathered the white steeple of the Baptist church in trembling pieces. The Ellison relatives came out behind him in small clusters, murmuring beneath umbrellas, their polished shoes avoiding the deeper water near the curb. Nathan did not look back. He had spent too much of his life learning what certain kinds of laughter were worth, and the answer was usually nothing. The key mattered. The note mattered. Duke's reaction mattered most of all. The truth was never in the manor. Those words kept moving through Nathan's mind as he crossed the sidewalk toward his old Chevrolet pickup, parked 2 blocks down near the laundromat because the meter there had been broken for months and no one had bothered to fix it. The truck was blue once, though time and weather had worn it toward a tired gray. A sleeping bag was rolled behind the seat. A canvas tool bag sat on the floorboard. 2 bottles of water, a half-empty tin of coffee, a flashlight, jumper cables, spare socks, and Duke's folded blanket made up the practical inventory of a life narrowed down to what could fit in a cab and still leave room for breathing. Duke jumped into the passenger seat and turned in a circle before sitting upright, service harness catching a stripe of pale window light. Nathan climbed in after him, shut the door, and let the quiet close around them. For a while, he only sat there. Rain tapped lightly on the roof. Across the street, the laundromat dryers turned behind fogged glass, orange circles glowing like small suns for people with pockets full of quarters. Nathan unfolded Margaret's note again, careful not to smudge the ink with his thumb. The truth was never in the manor. It sounded less like a clue than a warning wrapped in kindness. He remembered Margaret Ellison not as a rich woman from the big house, but as an 82-year-old widow under a church awning on a Sunday afternoon, standing beside a stalled Lincoln while rain poured off the roof in silver ropes. 3 weeks earlier, Nathan had been walking back from the church basement, where volunteers served chili and coffee after service. He had not planned to stop. He rarely planned anything more than a day ahead anymore. But Duke had paused first, ears forward, eyes fixed on the woman trying to lift the hood of her car with hands too thin for the task. People were leaving in a hurry, collars up, umbrellas open, engines starting. Margaret did not call out. That was what made Nathan cross the lot. He knew the posture of someone trying not to need help. The battery cable had corroded at the terminal. Nothing dramatic. Nothing worthy of a speech. He cleaned it with the edge of a pocket knife, tightened the clamp, and kept his jacket over Margaret's shoulders while she sat in the cab with Duke's warm head resting against her knee. When the engine turned over, she looked at Nathan as if she had been waiting years to meet a man who could bring something back to life without asking what it was worth. She offered him money. He refused. She asked why a man with nowhere to go would still stop for someone else. Nathan had looked at the rain sliding down the windshield and said, "Ma'am, being passed by is something I know too well. Now, sitting outside the laundromat with her key in his hand, he wondered if that sentence had followed her home. He had been part of many veteran stories, though none that sounded polished enough for speeches. Army field repair had taught him to make broken things useful again under pressure: generators, trucks, pumps, trailers, radios, anything with a hinge, wire, belt, bolt, or stubborn piece of metal that still had life inside it. He could hear when an engine was about to quit. He could smell a bad wire before smoke appeared. He could rebuild a carburetor on a tailgate and patch a radiator with patience and prayer. Yet after coming home, the one machine he could not repair was the ordinary life everyone expected him to operate. Jobs came and went. Rent rose faster than pay. Sleep became light. Pride became expensive. The Chevrolet became a room, then a house, then the only address Duke understood. The German Shepherd had stayed through all of it, through rest areas off the highway, church parking lots, cold mornings behind the feed store, and long evenings when Nathan pretended to read old manuals just to avoid counting the hours until dawn. Duke did more than alert him when anxiety tightened the air. He reminded him to eat. He woke him from dark dreams without fuss. He leaned into Nathan's leg when memories pulled too hard. He listened to the world with a seriousness that made survival feel less lonely. Nathan turned the brass key over in his hand. It was small, but its edges were worn smooth, touched often by someone who believed in what it opened. "What did you hear in there, boy?" he asked. Duke looked toward the east end of town, where the road curved past the Baptist church and out toward Ellison Manor. His ears lifted with quiet certainty. Nathan followed the dog's gaze. Beyond the wet streets and low brick shops, beyond the gas station sign blinking in the drizzle, the old estate waited behind white fences and oak trees, its grand house facing the county road while the carriage house stood somewhere behind it, unseen by people who only valued front doors. Nathan started the truck. The engine turned reluctantly, then settled into a rough but faithful idle. He pulled away from the curb and drove through Willow Creek at 25 miles per hour, past the pharmacy, the diner, the war memorial with fresh flags at its base, and the church where Margaret had last placed her hand on Duke's head. The wipers moved slowly across the windshield. The sky opened in pale seams above the Kentucky hills. As the town thinned into pastureland, the road began to shine under returning light. Tobacco barns leaned in the distance. Blackboard fences followed the curves of wet fields. Oak branches reached over the lane, dripping rain like the last notes of an old hymn. Nathan felt the key grow warm in his pocket, though he knew it was only his own body heat. Still, something about the day had changed. He had left the law office with what others called a garage. He was driving toward what Margaret called the truth. And beside him, Duke sat tall and steady, eyes fixed ahead, as if the German Shepherd already knew that the road behind the manor was not leading them to what had been discarded, but to what had been protected. The road to Ellison Manor curved through a stretch of Kentucky countryside that looked as if it had been painted in layers of rain, tobacco fields dark and breathing, white fences shining wet, oak trees lifting their heavy branches over the lane like old guardians of family secrets. Nathan drove slowly, not because the Chevrolet could not handle the road, but because something about the estate ahead made hurry feel disrespectful. Duke sat upright in the passenger seat, his silver gray and tan coat catching soft bands of light each time the clouds thinned, his amber eyes fixed past the windshield with a focus Nathan had come to trust more than weather reports, maps, or the careful opinions of men behind desks. The brass key rested in Nathan's jacket pocket beside Margaret's note, and every few minutes his thumb found it without thinking. The truth was never in the manor. The sentence followed him mile after mile, through the low green hills and over the creek bridge where water moved brown and swollen beneath sycamore roots. He passed the old Baptist church first, its white steeple bright against the gray sky, the same awning where Margaret had stood in the rain 3 weeks before. For a moment, Nathan could see her again, small but straight-backed, one hand on Duke's head, her eyes clearer than the weather. He wondered how many things she had known and chosen not to say. The estate entrance appeared half a mile beyond the church, marked by 2 brick pillars softened by moss and a black iron gate standing open as if it had grown tired of keeping the world out. A small metal sign read Ellison Manor Private Drive, though one side hung crooked, tapping faintly in the breeze. Nathan turned in. Gravel crackled under the tires. The driveway ran long between rows of old oaks, their limbs arching above like the ribs of a cathedral, drops of rain falling from leaf to leaf in slow bright beads. Beyond them, the manor finally rose into view. It was larger up close than it had ever looked from the road, a white-columned southern house with deep porches, tall windows, and dark shutters closed against the morning. Once, it must have commanded admiration. Now the paint had dulled, vines climbed the side steps, and the lawn near the fountain had gone wild at the edges. Wealth, Nathan thought, could look lonely when no love remained to warm it. He parked near the circular drive but did not get out immediately. Duke turned his head away from the manor almost at once. The German shepherd looked past it, toward the rear of the property, where a narrower service road disappeared behind magnolia shrubs and a leaning stone wall. Nathan followed his gaze. "Not the big house," he murmured. Duke's ears flicked, and that was answer enough. Mr. Langford had told him the manor itself would remain locked until the estate inventory was complete. Nathan did not care. The white columns held no invitation for him. He guided the Chevrolet around the side drive, where gravel gave way to packed earth and rainwater gathered in shallow ruts. The scenery changed behind the manor. The front lawn had been staged for visitors, the back acreage told the truth of work. There was a sagging tool shed, a rusted hand pump, stacked firewood under a tin lean-to, an old orchard beyond a split-rail fence, and finally the carriage house, sitting beneath 3 giant oak trees as if it had been waiting in their shade for decades. It was built of red brick and dark wood, with a slate roof stained by moss, arched double doors, and small upper windows clouded by dust. Iron rings were still fixed to the outer wall where horses might once have been tied. A weather vane shaped like a running horse leaned slightly above the roofline. The place did not look grand, but it had a steadiness the manor lacked. It looked used. Remembered. Held together by purpose instead of pride. Nathan stepped out into damp air scented with wet grass, old leaves, leather, and distant honeysuckle. Duke jumped down beside him and went still. Not alert in the way he became around strangers or traffic. This was different. His nose lowered toward the ground, then lifted toward the arched doors. He inhaled once, deep and slow, and a small tremor moved through his shoulders. Nathan had seen that response only a handful of times, near a hidden gas leak behind a church kitchen, beside a culvert where a lost child's mitten had been caught on a branch, outside a rest area bathroom where an elderly man had fainted and made no sound. Duke did not guess. He gathered the world until the world told him where to stand. Nathan walked to the door and found the lock beneath a rusted latch. The brass key slipped in more smoothly than he expected. When he turned it, the old mechanism clicked with a soft, obedient sound, as if it had never doubted he would come. The door opened inward, releasing air thick with time, leather tack, hay, cedar, dust, motor oil, rain-soaked wood, and the faint sweetness of apples stored long ago and remembered by the walls. Light entered in a wide gray sheet behind him. Inside, the carriage house was larger than it looked from outside. To the left were stalls converted into storage bays. To the right, a long workbench ran beneath pegboards where tools hung in careful rows, some rusted, some wrapped in cloth. Harnesses, bridles, old reins, and cracked leather saddles lined the far wall. A green tractor hood leaned against one corner. There were oil cans, wooden crates, a bicycle missing one wheel, a church pew with a split seat, and a coffee tin on the bench beside a radio that looked older than Nathan. Dust softened everything, but it did not erase the order. Whoever had last used this place had not abandoned it in chaos. They had left it as a man leaves a shop when he expects to return after supper. Nathan moved deeper inside, boots quiet on the stone floor. He ran his fingers along the workbench and found the surface worn smooth in front of the vise, where years of hands had repaired stubborn pieces of life. The place stirred something in him. Not memory exactly, but recognition. He had always understood shops better than living rooms. In a shop, things told the truth. A broken belt did not pretend to be whole. A loose wire did not smile while failing. A cracked hinge asked only for attention and the right tool. Duke walked past him toward the tack wall. The German shepherd stopped before a row of old saddles and iron hooks, nose pointed at a narrow seam between 2 vertical boards. His ears rose. His breathing changed. Nathan watched him for several seconds, the room dim and golden around them, rain ticking softly on the slate roof. "You found something," he said. Duke did not bark. He simply lifted one paw and placed it against the wall, gentle but certain. Nathan stepped closer and pressed his palm to the boards. They felt cool, dry, and solid at first. Then, beneath the old leather smell and the silence of the carriage house, he felt it, the faintest hollow give behind the wood, as if the wall were keeping a room-shaped secret. Outside, the manor stood proud and locked behind its columns. But here, behind the house, under moss, dust, and the patient eyes of a loyal German shepherd, the truth had begun to breathe. Nathan kept his palm against the tack wall while Duke stood beside him, steady as a witness. The carriage house had gone so quiet that the soft rain on the slate roof seemed to come from very far away. For a moment, Nathan did nothing. He simply listened with the dog, letting the old building speak in its patient language of wood, stone, leather, and air. The wall before him looked ordinary enough, 2 rows of dark vertical boards holding saddles, reins, bridles, and iron hooks dulled by years of dust. Yet beneath his hand was that faint hollow give, not large, not obvious, just enough to tell a man who had spent half his life repairing machines that something had been covered with care. He reached into his canvas tool bag and pulled out a small flashlight, a flat pry bar, and a screwdriver worn smooth at the handle. He did not tear at the boards. Something about the place asked for gentleness. He removed the nearest saddle first, lifting it from the peg with both hands. The leather was cracked but still rich with the smell of oil and work. On the underside, someone had burned the initials D.E. into the strap. Nathan paused, thumb resting against the letters. Daniel Ellison, though he did not know the name yet, seemed to stand near him in that small mark, a man hidden in plain sight by 2 initials the family no longer mentioned. Duke sniffed the saddle, then returned to the wall and placed his nose near a narrow seam behind the lower tack rail. Nathan unscrewed the rail carefully. The screws resisted, then turned free one by one, dropping into his palm with tiny metallic taps. Behind the rail, the boards showed a thin outline, almost invisible under dust. Not a door, not exactly. More like a panel meant to disappear unless someone knew to look for the edge. Nathan worked the pry bar into the seam and pressed. The panel gave a soft pop, followed by a breath of cooler air from inside the wall. Dust drifted into the flashlight beam like pale gold ash. Duke leaned forward, ears high, but did not enter the space. Instead, he looked back at Nathan, waiting. "All right," Nathan whispered. "I see it." Inside the hidden hollow sat a walnut box, no bigger than a family Bible, wrapped in a square of faded blue cloth. The same shade, Nathan realized, as the strip tied to Margaret's brass key. He lifted the box out and carried it to the workbench. The wood had darkened with age but was polished in the center, where hands had touched it often. There was no lock, only a brass clasp. Nathan opened it beneath the gray window light. Inside lay a careful arrangement of memory, black and white photographs, handwritten letters tied with string, an old vehicle registration card, a brass key smaller than the first, a folded blueprint of the carriage house, and a strip of paper on top written in a strong hand that was not Margaret's. The truth was never in the manor. Nathan felt the words settled differently this time. On Margaret's note, they had sounded like a clue. Here, they sounded like a testimony. He picked up the first photograph. A young man stood in front of the carriage house sometime in the late 1970s, sleeves rolled to his elbows, grease on his hands, one boot resting on the bumper of an old farm truck. He had the Ellison jaw, but none of the manor's pride. Beside him sat a German shepherd with a dark saddle coat and bright eyes, wearing no harness, only a worn leather collar. On the back of the photo, in Margaret's handwriting, were the words, Daniel and Amos, before they made him disappear from the family stories. Nathan read the sentence twice. Duke pressed closer, his shoulder warm against Nathan's leg. The second photograph showed Daniel older, sitting at the workbench with 3 men in worn jackets, all holding coffee mugs, all looking toward the camera with the uncertain smiles of people not used to being photographed when kindness found them. The third showed the carriage house doors open at night, a lantern burning above the threshold, a truck with its hood raised, and a handwritten sign propped against a tire, "Coffee is hot. Tools are free if your hands are honest." Nathan lowered the photographs with care. The room around him seemed to deepen. Rain tapped the roof. Somewhere in the manor beyond the trees, relatives were likely measuring silver, china, and furniture, believing they had inherited the important pieces. But here, on a scarred workbench behind the house, lay proof of a different kind of wealth, the kind built from service, repair, and quiet mercy. He untied the letters. The first was addressed to Margaret from Daniel. "Mama," it began, "I know they want me in the front house, clean jacket, polite smile, no talk about the places I cannot sleep through in my head. But I breathe better out here. The horses are gone, but the building still knows work. Men come by with broken trucks and broken spirits, and most days I can fix at least the truck." Nathan stopped reading. The sentence felt so honest it almost hurt to hold. He had known men like that at highway rest areas, outside hardware stores, behind county buildings, men who asked about oil filters when what they needed was a chair, coffee, and someone who did not make them explain why they were tired. He read further. "If they say I left, do not believe it. I am still here, behind the house, where they do not look." That was when Duke moved. The German shepherd stepped to the far end of the tack wall, sniffed beneath a row of old bridle hooks, and gave one soft, deliberate tap of his paw against the lower board. Nathan followed him, letters still in hand. This section of wall was older than the panel he had opened, the boards darker, the nails square-headed. He brushed away dust and found a faint blue line painted along the edge, almost hidden beneath age. On the blueprint from the walnut box, a small rectangle had been drawn behind that exact place. Beside it, someone had written, "Blue Door." Nathan's heartbeat slowed, not from fear, but from the gravity of recognition. The walnut box had not been the secret. It had been the invitation. He removed 2 more boards and found a narrow door no taller than his shoulder, painted a faded blue so soft it looked like sky seen through rain. At its center was a small brass keyhole. Nathan took out the second key from the box. It fit. The lock opened with a clean click that seemed to travel through the whole carriage house. Duke stood beside him, calm, certain, amber eyes reflecting the dim light. Nathan rested his hand on the blue door but did not open it immediately. He thought of Margaret at the church, of her asking why he stopped. He thought of the relatives laughing in the lawyer's office, of the manor with its proud columns and closed shutters. He thought of all the veteran stories no one finished telling because the people living them had been moved to the back of the house, out of sight, where polite families could forget the cost of being brave. Then he pushed the door open. Warm cedar air touched his face from the darkness beyond, carrying the scent of paper, machine oil, coffee, and something almost like home. Duke stepped forward first, not pulling, only leading, and Nathan followed into the hidden room where the truth Margaret protected had waited without bitterness, patient enough for the right man and the right dog to find it. Duke entered the hidden room first, not with excitement, but with the solemn care of a creature stepping into a place where grief had learned to become useful. Nathan followed, ducking beneath the low blue doorframe, and the beam of his flashlight moved slowly across cedar walls, a narrow work table, shelves lined with ledgers, coffee tins, folded blankets, jars of screws, old invoices, and photographs pinned in careful rows. The room was small, no bigger than a storage stall, yet it held more life than the manor outside with all its columns and closed curtains. The air was dry and faintly warm, carrying the scent of machine oil, cedar shavings, paper, and coffee grounds sealed so long in metal that the room seemed to remember mornings no one else had counted. Nathan stood still until his eyes adjusted. On the far wall, painted in white letters above a row of hand tools, was a sentence that made the silence gather around him: "A road home begins with one working hand." Duke sat beneath the words, his amber eyes lifted toward Nathan, as if he had led him not to a treasure chest, but to a commandment written in the language of work. Nathan stepped to the table. A green banker's lamp sat there, unplugged, its brass stem dulled but graceful. Beside it was a leather ledger with Daniel Ellison's name written on the inside cover. Nathan opened it carefully. The pages were filled with names, dates, repairs, and notes that began in the late 1970s and stretched across decades. Alternator fixed, no charge. Took coffee and left smiling. Starter replaced, paid later with tomatoes. Drove Mr. Keene to clinic in Lexington. Let Marine sleep install 3 nights, dog named Rosie. Bus repaired for church youth trip. Veteran from Ohio needed work, sent to Miller's farm. Woman with service dog needed quiet, stayed 2 nights, like the blue blanket. The entries were plain, almost spare, but each one carried the shape of a life being steadied before it slipped further into the dark. Nathan read them with the feeling that he had found a map of invisible kindness, not the kind polished for newspapers, but the kind done before sunrise, under shop lights, with grease on the hands and coffee cooling on the bench. He turned another page and found Margaret's handwriting in the margins, smaller and softer than Daniel's. Leave porch light on in rain. Buy more dog bowls. Do not let him refuse supper. He says he is fine when he is not. Nathan looked away for a moment. Some sentences enter a man quietly and sit down beside old wounds without asking permission. He thought of himself outside diners, telling strangers he was fine because the alternative required too much explanation. He thought of Duke nudging his hand toward food on nights when pride had convinced him hunger was easier than asking. Across the room, Duke sniffed a cot folded against the wall, then a wool blanket tied with string. The blanket was clean despite its age, wrapped in brown paper and labeled rest stop use. Nathan ran his fingers along a shelf of old coffee mugs, each one different, some chipped, some bearing faded logos from feed stores, gas stations, and church picnics. This was not a secret room built for hiding money. It was a room built so men and women could sit down without being examined. On another wall hung photographs of the Carriage house in different seasons. Snow against the double doors. Summer vines along the brick. A pickup with its hood raised under a lantern. Daniel standing beside veterans of different ages, some smiling, some too tired. Nathan remained in the hidden room until the rain softened into mist and the light outside the Carriage house shifted from silver morning to the muted gold of afternoon. Time felt different behind the blue door, less like hours passing and more like years being returned to their proper names. He read through Daniel's ledger slowly, not because the words were difficult, but because each entry deserved to be witnessed. The names were ordinary American names, the kind that might appear on mailboxes, repair orders, church bulletins, and faded photographs. Roy Madsen, heater repaired, stayed one night with hound dog. Patricia Vale, tire replaced, given coffee, no charge. Ernest Polk, slept in stall 2 after losing apartment, found work at Johnson's Orchard. Marine named Samuel, said little, swept the shop before leaving. Woman from Tennessee, service dog named Clover, needed quiet and a dry blanket. Nathan ran his thumb down the page and felt the shape of the work Daniel had chosen. It was not charity with a bright sign and a speech attached. It was repair. It was rest. It was one person refusing to let another person disappear. Duke wandered the room with calm interest, nose moving along the lower shelves, pausing near the folded blankets, then beneath the workbench, where a row of dog bowls sat stacked inside one another. Nathan noticed they had been polished clean before storage. Even that nearly undid him. Someone had thought about the dogs. Someone had known that a veteran standing at the edge of his own pride might refuse a meal for himself, but would accept water for the animal who had stayed. He opened the trust papers again and placed them beside Margaret's final letter. The legal language still felt heavy, but beneath it he saw the heartbeat clearly. The rear parcel belonged separately to the Carriage house. The maintenance account existed. The workshop tools were protected. The purpose had been recorded, not merely wished. Margaret had not left him a dream that would collapse when morning came. She had left him something structured enough to survive relatives, rumors, and the slow weathering of time. Near the bottom of the file box, Nathan found a sealed envelope addressed to Mr. Everett Langford, to be opened only if the man named Nathan Cole returns with Daniel's ledger. He let out a quiet breath. Margaret had known the family would not look. She had known a lawyer could only release what the right person was willing to uncover. And somehow, she had trusted Duke to bring him to the wall. Nathan gathered the ledger, the trust folder, the envelope, and several photographs into his canvas bag. Before leaving, he stood once more beneath Daniel's painted words. A road home begins with one working hand. He looked down at his own hands, scarred, rough, darkened with dust from the Carriage house wall. For years, those hands had kept him alive by fixing small failures in other people's lives. A loose cable. A dead starter. A broken hinge. A leaking pump. But he had not believed they could build anything that would hold him too. Duke stepped to the blue door and waited. The hidden room seemed to settle behind them as Nathan turned off the flashlight, not abandoned, but entrusted. Outside the carriage house, the air smelled of wet brick, grass, and old oak bark. The manor stood beyond the trees, white and silent, its tall windows reflecting a sky that had begun to clear. Nathan loaded the papers into the Chevrolet, then looked back at the carriage house. From the outside, nothing had changed. The moss still clung to the slate roof. The old iron rings still marked the wall. The double doors still sagged at one hinge. But Nathan knew the truth now. The building was not a leftover. It was the part of the estate that had remembered how to serve. He drove back into Willow Creek with Duke beside him, the canvas bag resting between them like a sleeping animal. The town moved in its late afternoon rhythm. School buses rolled past the courthouse. A man swept water from the entrance of the hardware store. The diner windows glowed warm enough to make the wet sidewalk look kind. Nathan parked in front of Langford's office, and this time he did not choose the farthest space. He walked in through the front door with Duke at his side. Mr. Langford looked up from his desk, saw the bag, saw Nathan's face, and slowly removed his glasses. She was right, the lawyer said before Nathan spoke. Nathan placed the ledger on the desk, then the trust folder, then the sealed envelope with Langford's name. She left instructions. She left prayers disguised as instructions, Mr. Langford said quietly. He opened the envelope with careful hands. As he read, his expression changed from professional calm to something older and more human. His eyes moved once toward Duke, who sat near Nathan's boot, steady and silent. Margaret wrote that if you found Daniel's room, I was to tell you everything the family refused to learn, he said. Nathan waited. Outside, a truck passed through a puddle, sending a soft rush of water along the curb. Mr. Langford folded the letter and laid it flat. Daniel Ellison was Margaret's only son. He came home from service and did not fit the house his family had prepared for him. They wanted him polished, quiet, grateful, and useful only in the ways that looked respectable at dinner. Daniel wanted work that meant something. He moved into the carriage house, repaired vehicles for people who could not afford a shop, and helped veterans passing through Willow Creek. Some stayed a night. Some found work. Some simply drank coffee and left before sunrise. His relatives called it embarrassing. Margaret called it holy. Nathan looked down at the ledger. The word holy did not feel too large. Not for what he had seen. Mr. Langford continued. After Daniel passed, the family preferred a cleaner version of the story. They said he left town. Margaret let them talk. But she spent the rest of her life protecting what he built. She separated the carriage house legally from the manor, funded the account quietly, and named one condition for the next caretaker. He turned the document toward Nathan. The line was underlined in Margaret's hand: the caretaker must be someone who understands the dignity of work, the loneliness of being passed by, and the loyalty of a dog. Nathan read it without moving. Duke leaned gently against his leg. For a moment, the law office disappeared around him, and he was back under the church awning in the rain, hearing Margaret ask why he stopped. He had thought his answer had been small. He understood now that it had been the key before the key. Do I have to prove anything? Nathan asked, his voice low. Mr. Langford's eyes softened. No. You already did. But there will be papers to sign, repairs to plan, permits to request, and relatives who may object once they realize the carriage house is not useless. Nathan almost smiled. I know how to fix stubborn things. The lawyer smiled back. Good. Because this may be one of them. They worked until the office lamps came on and the evening turned blue against the windows. Nathan signed where he was asked, initialed where necessary, and listened as Mr. Langford explained the account, the parcel boundaries, the workshop protections, and the first steps toward reopening the place under its original purpose. None of it was simple. That made it feel real. Miracles, Nathan was beginning to understand, did not always arrive finished. Sometimes they arrived as responsibility, with dust on their sleeves and a stack of forms waiting to be filed. When he finally stepped outside, the rain had stopped completely. The pavement shone under the streetlights. Duke paused on the sidewalk and looked toward the road leading back to the manor. Nathan followed his gaze and felt no pull toward the front house, no envy for the columns or the portraits or the rooms filled with things people would appraise. His inheritance was behind the house, where Daniel's tools waited, where Margaret's coffee tin still held the scent of welcome, where a blue door had opened because a German shepherd had listened to what pride ignored. Nathan placed his hand on Duke's head. "Looks like we have work," he said. Duke's tail moved once, slow and certain. And in that simple motion, beneath the lamps of a small Kentucky town, Nathan felt the first clear road home begin beneath his feet. The next morning, Nathan returned to the Carriage house before the sun had fully cleared the oak trees. Willow Creek still wore the last blue shadows of dawn, and the wet grass along the rear drive shone with beads of light that trembled whenever the breeze moved through. Ellison Manor stood in the distance, pale and proud behind its columns, but Nathan no longer felt small beside it. He parked the Chevrolet near the arched double doors, and Duke stepped down onto the gravel with the calm authority of a dog reporting for duty. The German shepherd walked first to the Carriage house threshold, sniffed the lower edge of the door, then turned and looked back at Nathan as if to say the work could begin. Nathan unlocked the doors and pushed them open. Morning entered in a white gold sheet, touching the stone floor, the workbench, the old tools, the saddles, and the blue door hidden behind the tack wall. Dust floated in the light like tiny pieces of memory being given back to the air. For the first hour, Nathan did not repair anything. He simply walked the room with a notebook, making lists. Roof leak above east corner. Double door hinge loose. Window sash swollen. Workbench strong. Vise usable. Electrical panel outdated. Water line unknown. Cot frame intact. Coffee shelf clean. Dog bowls present. He wrote with the careful focus of a man who understood that dreams did not become shelter by feeling beautiful. They became shelter through measurements, permits, lumber, wiring, heat, and the willingness to start with one broken hinge. Duke stayed near the tack wall, occasionally lifting his head toward sounds Nathan could not hear: a squirrel in the loft, water dripping beyond the rear wall, the distant hum of a truck on the county road. Around mid-morning, Mr. Langford arrived with a folder of copies and a thermos of coffee he claimed he had not brewed himself, which Nathan believed immediately. Behind him came Ruth Bell, the county clerk, a narrow woman in a raincoat with silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her head and a clipboard held against her chest like a shield. She looked at the Carriage house, then at Nathan, then at Duke. "Mrs. Ellison told me once this place mattered," she said. "I thought she meant sentimentally." Nathan opened the double doors wider. "Turns out she meant legally too." Ruth almost smiled. They spent the next 2 hours walking the property lines, checking the rear parcel map, comparing county records against Margaret's trust documents, and noting which repairs could begin immediately and which required inspection. None of it had the shine of a storybook miracle. It was slow, practical, and full of ordinary obstacles: forms, dates, fees, code requirements, well testing, and access rules. Yet Nathan found himself grateful for that. Paperwork gave the promise weight. Regulations made it visible to a world that often ignored what was only holy. By noon, a pickup rolled up the service road, and a stocky man in his late 60s climbed out carrying a carpenter's level and a paper sack of biscuits. His name was Walter Haynes, retired from the county road crew, though everyone called him Walt. Margaret had listed him in the trust file under possible help, honest, complains loudly, shows up anyway. Walt walked around the Carriage house, tapping brick with 2 knuckles, eyeing the roofline, and muttering about neglect with the affection of a man already deciding how to fix it. "This building is sound," he said at last. "Ugly in places, but sound." Nathan looked up at the moss-streaked slate. "I have been called worse." Walt studied him, then laughed. "Then you and the building ought to get along." Word traveled by afternoon. A woman from the Baptist church brought a pot of soup and paper bowls. The hardware store owner sent a roll of contractor plastic and a box of nails with a note that said, "Put it on the Ellison account if there still is one." A young mechanic from the gas station stopped by after his shift and asked if the old air compressor worked. Nathan told him not yet. The young man said he would come back Saturday. Not everyone came kindly. Near 3 o'clock, Two Ellison relatives drove up in a black sport utility vehicle and stepped out wearing expressions polished for disagreement. The man in the navy sport coat from the law office looked past Nathan into the carriage house as if seeing it clearly for the first time had offended him. He said they had not been informed that the rear parcel contained operational funds. He said the family deserved transparency. He said Margaret had been old and sentimental. Nathan listened without interrupting. Duke stood at his side, not threatening, not restless, simply present with his amber eyes calm and level. When the man finished, Nathan wiped his hands on a rag and spoke quietly. Mr. Langford has the documents. The county has the filings. Margaret knew exactly what she was protecting. The woman beside the man glanced toward the blue door, still partly visible behind the removed tack boards. And what exactly was so important back there? Nathan looked into the carriage house, at Daniel's workbench, the ledgers, the photographs, the coffee tins, the bowls for dogs, the cot folded for someone too tired to keep driving. He could have explained all of it, but he knew some truths become smaller when offered to people determined not to receive them. A place where people were helped, he said. That is all. The man gave a short, humorless breath. You expect us to believe my aunt left a homeless stranger part of our family estate because of some repair shop? Nathan met his eyes then, not with anger, but with the steadiness of someone who had been measured wrongly too many times to fear another ruler. No, he said. I expect you to read what she signed. The silence after that was clean. Duke took one step forward and sat between Nathan and the door, as if marking the boundary without hostility. The relatives left with promises to call attorneys. Mr. Langford, who had watched from beside his car, sighed softly. They may make noise. Nathan picked up the carpenter's level Walt had left on the bench. Noise does not fix a roof. By evening, the first sheet of contractor plastic covered the leaking corner. The old workbench had been cleared. Daniel's ledger rested safely in a metal cabinet. Ruth Bell had marked the inspection forms. Walt had promised to return with scaffolding. The soup pot sat empty near the door. Nathan stood in the carriage house as sunset poured through the small upper windows, turning the dust gold and the brick walls warm as bread from an oven. Duke lay near the threshold, his head on his paws, watching the service road. For the first time, the building did not feel like a secret waiting to be found. It felt like a promise beginning to be used. Nathan touched the blue doorframe before closing it for the night. He thought of Daniel, who had chosen the back room over the front parlor. He thought of Margaret, who had protected what pride ignored. And he thought of all the veteran stories that never needed to be allowed to be true, stories of men and women who only needed one place where their hands were useful and their dogs were welcome. Outside, the porch light flickered when he tested the switch, blinked twice, then stayed on. Nathan stood beneath its small amber glow with Duke beside him. It was not much light against the white Kentucky evening, but it reached the gravel drive, the wet grass, and the first few feet of the road home. For a beginning, that was enough. Over the next 3 weeks, the carriage house changed by small honest measures, the way a life changes when it stops trying to become impressive and starts becoming useful. The leaking corner was sealed first, then the broken window sash, then the sagging hinge on the arched double doors. Walt Haynes brought scaffolding and complained loudly about every board before fastening each one with the care of a man who secretly loved soundwork. Ruth Bell returned with inspection forms, well reports, and a list of requirements that made Nathan's head ache until she sat beside him at the workbench and explained them one line at a time. Mr. Langford handled the family objections with patient legal language, the kind that moved slowly but left deep tracks. The Ellison relatives made phone calls, sent letters, and questioned Margaret's judgment, but the trust held because Margaret had built it to hold. She had known pride would arrive wearing good shoes and asking for signatures. She had prepared for it with dates, deeds, witnesses, and the quiet stubbornness of a woman who had spent years protecting a son the family had tried to misplace. Nathan slept most nights in the Chevrolet at first, parked beside the service road beneath the oak trees, with Duke stretched across the passenger seat and the porch light glowing over the gravel. The carriage house had a cot, but he did not use it right away. Some gifts are harder to accept than hardship. Hardship asks only that a man endure it. A gift asks him to believe he is allowed to receive. Duke seemed to understand. Each evening, the German shepherd would stand near the cot, look at Nathan, then look at the folded blanket, as if making a case without words. On the 9th night, rain came hard from the west, sweeping across the estate and rattling the old slate roof. Nathan finally carried his sleeping bag inside, set it on the cot, and lay down under Daniel's painted sentence. A road home begins with one working hand. He slept poorly, then deeply, then woke before dawn with Duke's head resting on the edge of the blanket and the room smelling of cedar, rain, and coffee grounds from a tin Margaret had labeled for cold mornings. It was the first time in months he had slept inside a place that expected him to be there when morning came. After that, the work moved differently. Nathan began to make the carriage house not just functional, but welcoming. He washed the old mugs, keeping the chipped ones because Daniel had kept them. He polished the dog bowls and placed them beneath a low shelf near the door. He cleaned the coffee tin and filled it fresh. He repaired the radio, coaxing it back to life until a country gospel station drifted through the room on Sunday morning, thin but warm. He built a simple rack for coats, added hooks for leashes, and marked the back stall as a quiet rest space with a cot, a heater, a reading lamp, and a folded blue blanket. He did not make the place pretty in the way the manor was pretty. He made it kind. By the 4th Saturday, volunteers arrived before Nathan finished his first cup of coffee. The young mechanic from the gas station brought the old air compressor back to working order. A church deacon installed a safer outlet near the workbench. Ruth's nephew cleared vines from the rear windows. Walt rebuilt the porch step. Someone brought biscuits. Someone else brought a stack of used towels for dogs. Duke greeted each person with careful dignity, accepting pats only after deciding they had come with good intentions. The first official referral came through Marcus Reed, a veteran outreach worker in Lexington who had known of Daniel's old project only by rumor. He called Mr. Langford, then Nathan, then drove down himself to see the place before sending anyone vulnerable into a promise that might not yet be ready. Marcus arrived in a Brown County vehicle with a clipboard, tired eyes, and a handshake that did not try too hard. He walked the carriage house slowly, reading Daniel's ledger, Margaret's letter, the posted trust purpose, and the repair plan taped above the workbench. At the blue door, he stopped for a long time. "I have seen programs with better funding," he said. "I have not seen many with this much soul." Nathan looked toward Duke, who had settled near the threshold in a square of sun. "Soul does not pass inspection by itself." Marcus smiled. "No. But it keeps people alive while the paperwork catches up." The next week, preliminary approval came for limited rest stop use, short stays by referral, no more than 2 guests at a time, service animals welcome, workshop support allowed under supervision, further expansion pending final review. It was not everything Daniel had dreamed, but it was the door opening. Nathan posted the approval notice inside the carriage house, beside a photograph of Daniel and Amos under the lantern. Then he took a clean board Walt had planed for him and painted the name Margaret had written in her final letter, the back door light. Beneath it, in smaller letters, he added, "For veterans finding the road home." When the sign dried, they hung it above the carriage house entrance at sunset. The manor stood in the distance, white and silent and mostly irrelevant now, while the small building behind it glowed with work lamps, coffee steam, and the soft movement of people cleaning up after a day that mattered. June rain had washed the air clear. Fireflies blinked over the wet grass. The gravel drive shone faintly under the porch light. Nathan stood back with paint on his hands and saw Duke sitting below the new sign, his amber eyes lifted as if he understood every word. In that moment, Nathan felt the truth Duke had found settle fully into the world. It was not merely that Daniel had lived here, or that Margaret had protected the papers, or that the family had been wrong about what mattered. The deeper truth was that usefulness could become grace when offered without pride. A repaired truck could be a prayer. A cot in a quiet stall could be a chapel. A bowl of water for a tired dog could be the first line of a man's return. Nathan had spent years believing he was outside the front door of life, waiting for someone to decide he belonged. Now he stood behind the great house, beneath a light that had survived misunderstanding, and realized the back door had been open all along. It had simply been waiting for someone humble enough to turn the key. The first guest came on a Thursday evening, when the sky over Willow Creek had turned the color of warm pewter and the summer rain had settled into a fine mist that softened the white fences, the oak trees, and the long gravel drive behind Ellison Manor. Nathan heard the truck before he saw it, a careful engine moving slowly along the service road as if the driver had been told to look for the back door but still could not believe a welcome would be waiting there. Duke lifted his head from the carriage house threshold, ears high, amber eyes steady. The porch light had come on automatically at dusk, casting a soft gold circle over the wet gravel and the new sign above the arched doors. The back door light. For veterans finding the road home. Nathan wiped his hands on a rag and stepped outside. He was still wearing the same worn olive field jacket, the faded denim shirt, the jeans softened at the knees, and the boots marked by honest mud, but something about him had changed in the weeks since Margaret's key entered his palm. His shoulders still carried weight, but not the old shapeless weight of drifting. This was the weight of responsibility, and it sat differently on a man. The Brown County vehicle stopped near the porch, and Marcus Reed climbed out first, rain dotting his clipboard and his cap. He nodded once to Nathan, then opened the passenger door. The man who stepped out was maybe 65, thin but upright, with a gray beard trimmed close, a canvas duffel in one hand, and a small black dog pressed carefully against his side on a leash. His name was Henry Wallace, a Navy veteran from outside Lexington, Marcus had said over the phone. He had lost his apartment after a long chain of ordinary troubles, the kind that never sound dramatic enough to explain how quickly a life can shrink. A missed payment. A broken truck. A job too far away. A landlord who could not wait. Henry looked at the carriage house, then at the sign, then at Nathan. His eyes held the cautious distance of someone who had learned that kindness often came with a time limit. "They said I could stay one night," Henry said, his voice rough but respectful. "Maybe two, if that is still all right." Nathan walked down the porch steps slowly, giving the man room to change his mind if pride demanded it. Duke came with him, not rushing, not crowding, only lowering his head enough for the small black dog to sniff the air without fear. "You can stay too," Nathan said. "And after that, we can talk about what the next right thing is." Henry looked down at Duke. The German shepherd's tail moved once, slow and calm. The small dog answered with a tiny wag of his own. Henry's hand loosened on the leash. That was the first repair of the evening, though no tool had touched anything yet. Inside, the carriage house glowed with lamplight. The workbench was clean. The tool wall stood ready. Coffee warmed in the old pot Nathan had brought back to use. Two mugs sat beside it, one plain white and one chipped blue from Daniel's shelf. The quiet rest stall held a cot with a folded blanket, a reading lamp, a chair, a towel for wet paws, and two bowls near the floor. Henry stopped at the sight of the bowls. "You let dogs in here?" he asked. Nathan glanced at Duke, who had already settled near the door as if guarding the dignity of the question. "Would not be much of a road home if we left family outside." Henry took off his cap and looked toward the ceiling. He did not speak for several seconds. Rain ticked softly on the slate roof. Somewhere beyond the rear windows, fireflies began blinking over the wet grass. Marcus looked down at his clipboard, giving the moment privacy. Nathan poured coffee into the chipped blue mug and set it on the workbench without ceremony. He had learned from Daniel's ledger that dignity lived in small details. Do not hover. Do not ask for the whole story before offering a chair. Let the coffee speak first. Henry sat slowly on the stool near the vise, his small dog curling at his boot. "I used to fix boat engines," he said after a while, eyes on the tool wall. Nathan nodded. "That air compressor still complains, and the mower behind the shed has not started since I found it." Henry's mouth shifted toward something almost like a smile. "Sounds like it has character." That is what people say when they do not want to call something stubborn. Henry gave a quiet laugh, and the sound changed the room. Not much, but enough. The carriage house seemed to take it in, the way old buildings take in smoke, weather, and prayer. Later, when Marcus had gone and the rain had faded into a cool summer night, Nathan opened Daniel's ledger to a fresh page. He wrote the date carefully, then Henry Wallace, Navy veteran, arrived in rain, dog named Scout, coffee accepted, may no boat engines. He paused over the last line, then added, Duke approved. The words looked at home on the page, following Daniel's old entries as if no years had passed, as if the work had only been sleeping and had now taken its next breath. Henry stayed 2 nights, then a week. He repaired the mower, then the air compressor, then a neighbor's generator that had been sitting useless since winter. He did not talk much about what he had lost. He did not have to. Each morning, he drank coffee under Daniel's painted sentence and found another small thing to fix. Other referrals came slowly after that, never too many, never faster than the place could hold. A woman with a service dog and a quiet voice stayed 3 nights after her car broke down outside town. A younger veteran slept one evening in the rest stall and left before sunrise after sweeping the floor so clean Walt said he wished all guests were that useful. A widower came by only to borrow tools, then stayed for soup, then returned the next week to help build shelves. The Carriage house did not become famous. That would have embarrassed it. It became known in the way useful places become known, by one person telling another that behind the old manor, past the white columns no one needed to admire, there was a porch light that stayed on and a man who would not ask too many questions before offering coffee. By autumn, the tobacco fields had turned bronze, the oaks dropped leaves along the service road, and the back door light shone earlier each evening. Nathan no longer slept in the Chevrolet. The truck still sat nearby, cleaned out now, carrying tools instead of all that remained of his life. His cot in the Carriage house had become his own, though he still left it neat every morning out of habit. Duke slept near the blue door most nights, where Daniel's hidden room opened into the workshop, and sometimes Nathan wondered if the dog heard old footsteps there, Daniel moving between bench and coffee pot, Margaret setting out bowls, Amos waiting at the threshold. Maybe memory had a sound only loyal creatures could hear. One October evening, Nathan stood outside beneath the sign while Duke sat beside him, his silver gray and tan coat glowing in the porch light. Across the wet grass, Ellison Manor rose pale and quiet, still large, still admired by passing cars, still full of furniture people could appraise. But Nathan did not look at it with envy. The truth had never needed columns. It had needed hinges that opened, tools that worked, coffee that stayed warm, and a door humble enough for tired people to approach without shame. He placed one hand on Duke's head and looked down the gravel road where another set of headlights was beginning to appear through the dusk. Somewhere inside the Carriage house, the radio played softly, the coffee pot clicked, and Daniel's ledger waited open on the workbench. Nathan had once believed he was a man left outside the story, living from parking lot to parking lot while the world passed by with its windows up. Now he understood what Margaret had seen before he did. Sometimes a person is not given a mansion because he is meant to guard something smaller and more sacred. Sometimes the miracle is not the house in front, but the light behind it. And sometimes, when kindness has been protected long enough, it finds the one man and one faithful dog who know how to keep it burning.